They thought the photograph would finish him. It arrived like a splintered message, blown up and passed around on cheap phones, posted to groups where men who had once feared his reach now felt suddenly untouchable. A single frame, the boss and a young man close enough that the angle meant consent, not calculation. The caption below it was cruelly simple: vulnerable, owned, weakness. By midnight, the city had sharpened into rain and neon and the kind of silence that comes right before someone decides to break things. Rivals who had spent years bending to his weight grinned as if they'd finally found leverage. Men who'd once called themselves his lieutenants started to text the number everyone knew for favors. Rumors move fast in that world. Vengeance moves faster. Eli Marlowe was trying to sleep when the first message came across a channel he shouldn't have been in anymore. He kept his phone face down on the small table next to the mattress, the only relic of the life he'd left, and stared at the dark ceiling instead. The room smelled faintly of oil and coffee, the way the city smells at 4 in the morning when everything is still. He remembered the face in the photo only as a blur at first, the way grief hides hard facts. He was not the boss. He hadn't been for a long time. He had been a fixer, a driver, a man who could smooth the edges of violent things until they fit. He'd walked away after Marco, his partner, died in an operation that had gone sideways. Marco had been the kind of person who left handwritten notes in his coat pockets, like small prayer flags. Eli kept one in his wallet still, the paper crumpled at the fold, a promise about coffee and rain and not letting fear win. That promise lived like a pulse under his ribs. It explained why he couldn't look away when the city started to break. On the other side of town, under a diner awning, a young man with paint under his fingernails bowed his shoulders against the rain. He wore a jacket that had seen better winters and a pair of boots that didn't quite belong to him. He had been 21 for 3 months and had already been taught, in a dozen small ways, that he might have to survive alone. He held his phone like a talisman and watched the feed swallow itself, a dozen comments promising ruin. He watched the messages from numbers he recognized, some from men he'd met at parties, some from men he had never expected to see again, and felt something inside him go very, very cold. Eli had not planned to be at the diner. He had been walking. He always walked too much now, and had paused under the neon for the heat of the sign. He saw the young man then, head down, trembling in the rain, as if he wasn't made for weather. There was no heroism in it. Eli's hands were used to doing things that kept people alive. He crossed the street without thinking, the way a man crosses a room to stand between a child and a fall, and offered a cigarette he didn't intend to smoke. The young man took it as if the gesture had been a lighthouse. "Are you all right?" Eli asked, voice low. He had the kind of voice that had once calmed a room. Now it only calmed the person who needed it. "No," the young man said. He looked up. The face in the rain was startlingly young. Sharp cheekbones, eyes too big for his face, and a bruise just starting to bloom beneath one temple. He swallowed, they think they can destroy him. They think it starts with me." Eli's thumb brushed the crumpled photograph in his pocket before he realized he was doing it. He had seen the face before the cameras made it public. The boss had been someone Eli had known in a different way, not the iron-willed man who ran things, but a private figure who wore his secrets like a second skin. Protecting secrets used to be Eli's job. This felt dangerously like home. "Come with me," Eli said. It wasn't a question. That was how rescue begins when rescue still lives inside someone's hands. Small, practical, entirely unspectacular. He hailed a cab and bought 2 coffees at a diner that hadn't changed since before the city learned to hate warmth. He wrapped the young man's hands around the hot paper cup and watched them tremble less. He bought a jacket 2 sizes up and, after some negotiating that involved money and a glare, a mechanic's shirt with paint flecks that matched the ones on the boy's knuckles. They sat at a booth and ate eggs that neither of them had bothered to promise they'd be able to taste. The world outside kept threatening to end. Inside the booth, there was the bright, necessary warmth of two bodies not alone. "What's your name?" Eli asked again, as if detail mattered. "Noah Rivera," the young man said. He said the name slowly, like it needed to land somewhere firm. "I'm 21. The name sounded like an apology and a declaration all at once. "You're not like that," Noah cut in. He wrapped his hands around the cup until the corners of his fingers whitened. Victor, he and I, we were together. I thought it would stay between us. I thought I knew the rules. But that photo, someone took it. Someone leaked it. They used it like a weapon. By morning, every dealer and lieutenant had it. My dad called." His teeth pressed into his lower lip. He said, "Get out." He said, "I brought shame." Noah's breath hitched. He slammed the door. Eli heard the old words of his city in Noah's sentence: shame, leverage, punishment. He had been schooled in men's languages and their silencings. He had seen countless people folded into smaller shapes until they fit a story someone else wanted to tell. "Your father," Eli began. "He's not him," Noah said, quick and sharp. "My father is Robert Holloway. He'd rather align with the men who move money than with me. He thinks if he steps away now, he can stay clean." Eli didn't say the things people say to soothe. He knew the soothing of platitudes when he heard them. He instead did small things. He called a contact who still owed him. He paid a man to watch the back door. He lit a cigarette and folded it between his fingers like a rite. He had a safe place, an old garage turned into a living room and studio, where he'd stored the belongings of a man who had died loving him, the drums of an old life and Marco's blanket folded in a chest. It wasn't legal, it wasn't clean, it was a roof. "You're safe for now," Eli said. "I'll make it safer." Noah laughed then, a thin, brittle sound. "You don't know them," he said. "They'll come for anything that ties him to me. They sent men to his house early. He didn't want them to find where I was, so he left me. He thought I could disappear. He thought wrong," Eli finished for him, because he had learned to be practical at the same time that he remained tender. "You didn't disappear, Noah. You were missed, or they wouldn't be looking." Eli drove them through streets that smelled of wet pavement and frying oil. He kept his eyes on the mirrors, on every reflective surface that could tell a car's license, a hooded figure, the flashlight beam that meant danger. There were messages on both their phones, taunts, photos, a video of a town hall with men pointing and laughing, and one blunt one that read, "They know where he is. Midnight is when they intend to come for him." When they reached the safe house, it looked smaller in daylight, an old garage with masonry like a face scarred by weather. Inside was the blue-tinged light of a single bulb and the smell of turpentine. It had been Marco's, an artist's corner, of brushes and canvas, a canvas that had been started and abandoned after the funeral. Eli moved with the practiced care of a man touching wounds. He stripped off Noah's wet coat and found the bruise, rudimentary but sharp. He pressed a cloth to it like a map, talking the while about nothing in particular, because nothing in particular sometimes steadied things better than truth. "I'll put you on the couch. You can have the old paint-splattered shirt. Marco wouldn't have minded a young man in it." He said Marco's name like a benediction. "You can sleep. There are blankets. I have some soups. I know a doctor who does favors for people who don't want a record. We'll get you seen." Noah watched him with the careful attention of someone who had been abandoned by every reliable clock he knew: family, the mob, sleep. The confession came like stones from a riverbed. "My father called them," he said finally. "He sold me because it keeps him safe. He said I was a liability. He pressed his palm against his mouth. I should have run. I should have known better than to think someone like Victor would try to keep me. Eli put his hand over Noah's. He'd learned the human geography of small comforts, the weight of a palm, the steadiness of a thumb. You didn't do anything wrong, he said. You didn't make their choices. The safe house started to feel like a small boat in rough water. Noah slept. Eli pulled the curtains tight and sat by the small window, listening to rain thread down the glass. He unwrapped a photograph from his wallet, the crease where Marco had written a promise, and wondered how many promises were strong enough to act as an anchor. He thought of the boss, a man people had called Victor Romano on official sheets and Vito in small, kinder moments. Eli had seen Victor's private face once, years ago, in a room where he allowed himself to be softer than the world warranted. The man in that photograph had the air of someone who had been used to giving orders because orders were a shield against tenderness. The next days moved in small, sharp beats. Word leaked like oil. Men in cars circling the neighborhood. A young enforcer looking for a name to attach to the photo. Eli performed the old rituals of containment. Alibi calls, directions that sent tails in one direction, while he sent both Noah and his soul in another. He called a former colleague, a detective who had once bent rules for a different kind of justice, Detective Rosa Alvarez. She had hair that never stayed bent by the weather, and a moral code that wasn't married to a badge, but to the idea of stopping harm. She owed Eli for something he'd done a long time ago and paid that debt with favors. We can protect him if we make the case loud enough, Rosa said when Eli explained. If we can show the leak came from them, from competing men who had access to the feed or his house, then it's a crime that's not just about pride or reputation. It's about intimidation and endangerment. I need proof. Eli handed over what he'd found. A thread of messages, screenshots, a license plate number he'd caught reflecting off a wet storefront. Rosa nodded in a way Eli recognized, careful, measured. This goes to my captain. We don't make promises we can't keep. Her voice had a legal quality, a river of slower, deeper commitments. The city under that rain turned smaller, contained by strategy. Eli took Noah to meet people who could do the small things that add up. Someone who could erase the worst of the forensic trail, a lawyer who knew how to file a complaint without triggering a larger wave. They worked in pieces, an intake at a youth shelter, a meal at a church kitchen where the cook spoke in a dialect of kindness. Noah's hands learned, slowly, to paint again. Eli found him a corner of Marco's studio, with brushes left where they had last been set down, bristles pointing like the ends of a story. Noah painted an eye first, vivid, bright, and terrified. He painted until the eyes started to look like people. The house, which had once kept a dead man's presence alive in small relics, started to hold two lives. There were small betrayals. Noah received a letter, no envelope, just a folded paper tucked under the stoop, that said simply, "He's your weakness. We will remove him." He didn't tell Eli at first. He tried to carry the weight himself and failed, face crumpling in the spare room where he slept. Eli found him there, curled like a child and shaking. "Don't hide things from me," Eli said. It wasn't a command. It was a truth. Noah told him then, in bursts. He told him about nights at parties, about the way Victor had been kind in private and sharp in public, about the way the mob valued secrets because they were currency. He told him about the call from his father that had sounded like a judge's gavel. He told him about the fear that his very existence could topple a man's empire. "You saved me," Noah said, fingers finding a blank spot on the couch cushion, leaving the prick of paint on fabric. "You didn't have to do that." Eli thought of Marco and his blank sleeves, the coffee stains on the table that had once been shared between two people planning a life. He thought of the price of leaving and the price of staying. "I had to," he said simply. "Don't make this about debt. Make it about the fact that we are still human. Make it about the fact that someone should be kept safe because we can keep them safe. As they worked, the rivals tightened their net. A van idled too long at the end of the street. A man with a face like bad weather appeared near the feed store where Noah used to buy paints. There was a night when the safe house door shuddered under a blow that didn't seek to open it, but to announce itself, to say, "I am here." Eli woke to a sound like the slow hammer of a message. He kept Noah quiet, made him patch the wound with ice, and called in favors. "Tomorrow," he told Noah in the grease light of a dawn, "we expose which men are using this. We make it public in the right way so the police have to do something or the city's going to burn with gossip and rumor. We get evidence, we go to Rosa, and we take the fight where it belongs." Noah's eyes were raw but steady. "And Victor, does he started. "Victor is not well," Eli said. "He has choices to make. He can tie himself to the old ways, or he can help end them. He can step forward and take responsibility from men who broke the line, or he can hide. But whatever he does, we are not handing you over to anyone." There was a small, stubborn pause where Noah swallowed the kind of hope he didn't know he had the right to keep. "And if he can't? Then we make sure the men who came after you pay for trying to use you as bait," Eli said. "We don't ask him to save you. We ask the law to stop them." They moved like two people building a raft out of whatever they could find. Eli went back into a world he'd tried to fold himself out of. He sat in rooms with men who had worked on both sides of the ledger. He leveraged the quiet terror he could still command. He found one of Victor's men willing to talk in exchange for a new life elsewhere. He sat with Rosa in a station basement and watched as she put charges together like a careful mason building a wall. The wall took evidence, testimony, a paper trail that revealed who had access to the photo, who had been delighted to pass it along. On the night the plan began, the city looked like a throat. Eli and Noah stayed in the garage, barricading windows with wood and sheets. Noah painted to keep the edges of his mind intact, a mural on the back wall of two hands reaching, not gripping, but offering. The paint smelled like rescue. Eli checked the locks again and again. He lined up the small acts that make bravery possible: a flashlight, a list of exit routes, a stack of photographs cataloged and ready to hand to Detective Rosa. He called Victor once. The line clicked through, and a voice answered with the measured sorrow of someone who had scaled up to a throne by way of compromise. "You shouldn't be mixed up in this," Victor said, and the sadness in him tasted like regret. "I'm not asking you to put your empire at risk," Eli said. "I'm asking you to do what protects people." "You don't understand," Victor said. "Everyone assumes the world will tear me down for this. If I step out—" His voice broke on the thought. "If I step out, they'll see me for what they always wanted me to be. They'll try to take everything. I can get you men in exchange for privacy." "There is no exchange for a person," Eli said. "There is only lying to yourself." Victor didn't say anything after that. He had lived in a structure that had no windows. His options were cornered. He had been both protector and machine, and secrets had been the oil that kept his gears moving. To reveal a secret was to risk everything. To hide it might mean allowing harm to continue. It was a calculus that had men like him deciding if their private heartbeats were worth public sacrifice. "They're coming in the morning," Victor whispered, finally. "If they find him—" "They won't," Eli said. And a test came like always, quiet, inexorable. At dawn, vehicles arrived at the perimeter. Men in dark clothes moved like a tide. There was a knock that sought to use a polite voice to get right to the soft center of things. Eli watched the street and listened to the dull, animal nervousness in his lungs. Noah sat on the couch with paint under his nails, his hand warm in Eli's, like a thing tethered to shore. Eli opened the door and answered like a man who had been taught to answer danger with a different kind of certainty. He was calm, and that calm had a geometry Eli had worked years to perfect. He told them the wrong things. He gave them a story that sent the wrong men to the wrong place. He watched them leave. He told Noah to keep hidden. He listened to a voicemail left on Victor's line from a rival boss. "We know where he is. We know you have him. Tonight, we finish." The message tipped the night's balance. It meant the men had decided to escalate, to use force rather than rumor. Eli called Rosa and laid the evidence out. She moved with a kind of practiced ferocity. Police cars rolled without lights. Men in uniforms who were not entirely a match for the world they were stepping into. They had probable cause, thanks to the thread of messages and plates Eli's contact had captured, and they had a warrant. Rosa was certain of one thing: if they didn't act, the tide would sweep them. The operation was surgical. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't fireworks. It was a set of men and women pushing through legal thresholds and the arm's-length violence that comes with it. The rivals had expected blood, so they had armored themselves for war. They hadn't expected law to step in at the speed of proof. There was a moment, in the waning light of a garage where the men being targeted were arrested, hammered open in a sweep that smelled like wet metal and the raw nervousness of men caught. Eli stood by the back wall as Detective Rosa and a unit moved in with evidence in hand. Men were cuffed, phones were taken. The men who had laughed at the photograph now had faces that did not look entirely sure where their cower had gone. It wasn't simple. One of the rivals' men took a shot into the air at the sound of the door and the sound of boots, a reckless noise that had been meant to start a stampede of fear. No one was killed, no one was maimed. The shooters were disarmed. The law, imperfect as it is, had made a boundary that night. There would be consequences for using another human being like bait. Victor turned up later at the station, like a man wearing an old regret. He had not been forced into a confession so much as he had been confronted with the evidence of what men do when they think someone else is weak. He could not stop what had been done to him, not entirely, but he could make a choice about what to do with the aftermath. In a private room behind glass, he offered testimony that helped convict two of the men who had spread the photograph, the ones who'd used their access and their contempt to ruin people for sport. His name remained mud in some circles, but the law, when given the right materials, had teeth. When the arrests came down and the men were taken away under the strict light of procedural certainty, the city seemed to unclench a little. Noah watched it all through the slats of a shutter like a witness to a small, honest miracle. He had feared rescue would be messy and punitive. Instead, it was a thing built on evidence and human intervention. There were no cinematic explosions, no triumphant lines. There was paperwork and the steady hand of people who chose to be good with the limited law they had. In the weeks that followed, the slow work of healing began. It wasn't neat or linear. Noah enrolled in a local community college, night classes, with a scholarship arranged by a woman at the shelter who had taken to him like a second mother. He joined a small art collective that painted murals in the alleys where men's histories were often told in spray paint and desperate hand. He began to see his life as something he could mark with brushstrokes rather than allow it to be marked for him. Eli watched him paint the mural in the alley across from the diner where they'd met. Two hands, not clenched, not holding, but offering something like an anchor. People stopped to look at it. Neighbors, kids from the high school, a few older men who had come out of their apartments to see what light had been made in the dark. The mural began to do what art does. It drew people in and made them hold still. Victor retreated in the way men like him sometimes do, repentant in private, pragmatic in public. He had choices stripped from him in a way that made him see the architecture of his life for what it was, built from fear and loyalty and the refusal to let vulnerability into the room. Whether he would rebuild on different foundations was a question for a future that he could not yet guarantee. Victor accepted that there would be legal consequences for the men who had acted on his behalf without boundaries. He agreed to testify to the degree that the law allowed. He did not become a righteous beacon. He became instead a man who had been reduced and rearranged by truth. Eli did not expect applause. He expected the quiet, truthful work that follows a rescue. There were dinners at odd hours where the conversation was about mundane things: an engine that needed fixing, whether the couch needed a new cover, the name of a neighbor's cat. There were therapy sessions for Noah. A woman at the shelter who specialized in trauma covered the cost for months, saying, "This is how we don't make another casualty of fear." Noah slowly began to voice things out loud. Shame, strangely enough, loses some of its power when spoken. He also learned in small, fierce ways to be brave again. He applied for a job at a local art supply store, where the owner let him have a table of his own after seeing his work. He told his father once, in a letter mediated by Eli, that he had not asked to be betrayed, and he did not know how to mend a father's heart when it had been chosen to align with fear. Robert Holloway read the letter and did not respond. The way they put the world back together involved practical gestures. Eli helped Noah secure a housing voucher tucked into the city program for people displaced by violence and intimidation. He helped him open a bank account and get an email address that did not belong to anyone else. They found a lawyer who would help with restraining orders against men who had harassed Noah in the wake of the photograph. Victor offered a payment into a community fund to aid people exposed similarly in the future. It was small, performative, and yet it became something. It became a seed. The most important thing, perhaps, was the small ceremony they held in the studio one late fall afternoon when the light came through thin and honest. Eli had a small wooden box he kept with Marco's belongings. In it was a folded shirt with a paint splatter in the precise color Noah had used for the eyes in his mural. "Marco would have liked your hands," Eli said quietly. He handed the shirt to Noah, who touched the paint and laughed as if it surprised him to be handed a thing that did not sting. "We're going to do something," Noah said. He had grown steadier over those months. "I want to make kits, like small things in a bag, a thermal blanket, a list of shelters and numbers, a little card that says you're not alone. People like me, we need a place to find each other." The idea landed like a small truth. Eli found he felt an old, careful warmth at the thought. It was the kind of giving back that did not announce itself with fanfare. He nodded. "Then we'll make the kits," he said. "We'll leave them at the bus station, behind the payphone, on the bench outside the shelter. We'll leave them with a note for whoever needs them." They spent one afternoon making kits in Marco's old studio, folding pamphlets and filling bags with instant coffee packets, socks, a list of phone numbers, and a small card painted by Noah with two hands reaching. They left one in a locker at the station with a note for the shelter to distribute, and another tucked under a bench near the mural they had painted. The final kit they placed in a little box bolted under an old community bulletin board, the sort of invisible kindness that watches for people who didn't know how to ask for help. Eli watched Noah fill bags with a kind of reverence. The man who had been abandoned by his father now had the power to hand someone else a small piece of shelter. The paradox was not lost on him. It was the pattern of life that hurt and then healed, the bridge that a single human hand could build. Months later, on a night when the rain came like a memory, Eli walked past the diner and saw a kid with a new jacket and paint on his knuckles, a pack on his shoulder, and a hopeful look. The kid stopped at the mural and ran a hand across the painted hands, as if to test whether the art was real. He smiled at it, as one might smile at a friend. Eli stood in the doorway and sipped his coffee. Marco's paper note still folded in his wallet, the ink softened by years. He thought about how secrets can be used like knives, and how people can be weaponized for leverage. He thought about how, when the world turned sharp, a handful of people chose to be blunt in a different way, to protect, to shelter, to make art, to call the police, and to stand in the way of cruelty. He thought about Noah painting eyes that could watch out, about Victor making a small restitution, about Detective Rosa, who had turned a phone thread into a warrant and a man into cuffs. None of it erased what had happened, but it had made a world where consequences meant something. Noah moved into a small apartment above a florist after he graduated a semester of classes, his walls papered with sketches and small canvases. He taught an after-school class to teens who wanted to try painting. He sat with them and showed them how to make hands that were open and offered. He told one of his students, a boy whose father had left and whose mother worked 2 jobs, that the world might tell him he had to minimize himself to be safe, but that safety didn't have to mean erasure. The boy's eyes reflected the understanding like a small mirror. Eli kept his watch in quieter ways now. He checked in, made sure the rent was paid when an emergency popped up, took Noah to the diner from time to time, and let him see the city as a place that could hold warmth. He had no illusions about cleaning the city of violence. He knew it would always have its fissures. But he also knew the stubbornness of people who choose to stay, people who bind themselves to others not out of obligation, but out of a kind of love that is practical and fierce. On the anniversary of Marco's death, Eli and Noah went to the mural. Noah had added a small signature, a pair of initials tucked into the corner in the color of Marco's favorite brush. They stood a minute, silent, the city making its usual noises around them. Noah put his hand on Eli's arm. It was a small, unflashy thing, the kind of anchor that holds. "We did right," Noah said. Eli looked at the mural, at the painted hands reaching out and offering. He had not expected to find a new kind of family when he stepped in to save a frightened young man under a neon sign. The world had surprised him. The boy who had been used as bait had become a maker of small sanctuaries. The boss, whose secret had been twisted into a weapon, had been made to face the truth of his network. The men who had thought themselves powerful enough to destroy were now listening to prosecutors. "In the ways that matter," Eli said. He said it softly, so that the city would keep its secrets and the mural would keep its light. That's what matters. They walked away then, leaving the mural to its small congregation of passers-by, men on their way to work, kids who used it as a backdrop for pictures, an old woman who nodded every time she passed. In the space between them, a person who had been betrayed by his father had a new anchor, a found family that had asked for nothing and given life. It was not the ending anyone would write in a dispatch or a headline. It was quieter. It hummed. If you want more stories that look at the hard edges of the city and the people who make new maps out of broken things, hit subscribe. The last image is not of victory in a ballroom. It's of a small box beneath a community board. Someone, Noah, Eli, or perhaps a neighbor, had bolted in place and painted on it in modest letters, "If you need help, take one." Inside, a thermal blanket, a card with phone numbers, a small sachet of coffee, and a painted card with 2 hands reaching out. It is the sort of kindness that doesn't demand notice. It asks only that someone who has been abandoned know that they might find a way back. On cool evenings, when the diner light glowed like a hearth and the city's noise softened into a lullaby, people would sometimes stop by that box and take what they needed. Sometimes they would leave a note. Once, someone left a tiny envelope with $3 and a thank you note. Once, a man left a small stone with a painted hand. Noah kept one of those stones on his windowsill. Eli never stopped keeping watch. He had learned that protection was not about controlling fate, but making sure that other people had a chance to find safety. He kept Marco's photograph in his wallet beside the stone, a relic and a reminder that tenderness had to become action. Victor's secret had been used as a weapon. The city had tried to sharpen it into a knife, but a few people had built a shield instead. They did not pretend the world was clean. They only insisted that there could be consequences for using a life as collateral, and that the injured could, with help, reorder their lives into something recognizable as hope. And so the mural remained. 2 hands reaching, a pair of eyes painted bright, a small city of people who decided to be the kind of family that stays. Near the mural, a little plaque had been added. No official ceremony, no ribbon, but a quiet, practical phone number for a shelter and the words in small print, "You're not alone." If this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to hear about found families and second chances, share this video and tell us in the comments where you found your people.